Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Think about the greatest empires in history. Usually we picture, immense stone monuments,
Mm.
pyramids, towering cathedrals, vast
Oh,
temples.
right,
And we
yeah.
tend to equate that solid, unyielding rock with the people who built it. We assume their history is just as rigid and fixed as the monuments they left behind in the jungle.
It is a common tendency to fixate on the stone. I mean, stone survives, right?
Yeah.
It provides a highly visible, tangible record, which makes it, well, incredibly easy to anchor our entire understanding of a culture to those specific enduring structures. But doing so often obscures the lived reality of the people who actually carved that stone.
Right. And that is exactly our mission today. We are doing a deep dive into the source material to look closely at the origins, the daily life, the enduring culture, and the spiritual worldview of the Khmer people. We are deliberately stepping away from the well-trodden narratives of the stone empire of Angkor. And we are stepping far back from the political tragedies of the 20th century. We are going to look at how an ancient people built an identity by learning to navigate and shape an environment that is constantly in flux.
And to start that exploration, we really have to look for the earliest traces of human presence in the region.
Which actually leads us to a pretty intriguing archaeological mix-up. It's known as the Crady controversy.
Yes, the Crady controversy.
For a long time, there was this idea that we had evidence of hominids making tools in Cambodia 600,000 years before present.
Yeah, the Crady controversy is a perfect example of how the landscape itself can trick us. So, back in 1963, researchers were surveying a site called Sera Spav in Crady province, and they found what they firmly believed were primitive stone tools.
Like actual hand axes and things like that.
Well, roughly shaped stone implements, yeah. For decades, this completely anchored the theory of an early Pleistocene hominid industry in the lower Mekong Basin. It suggested human ancestors were there, actively shaping tools hundreds of thousands of years ago.
But when modern researchers went back to double-check this, they realized they weren't looking at tools at all.
Exactly. A rigorous re-examination in 2009 demonstrated that these stone specimens were the result of prehistoric fluvial movements.
Okay, let's ground that for a second. Fluvial movements just means the action of the river, right? So the river was...
Yes, the river was carving the rocks. You have to picture the raw power of the Mekong River over hundreds of thousands of years. The water tumbles these rocks against each other, chipping and shaping them in ways that coincidentally mimic the flaking patterns of early human stone tools.
Oh, wow. Wait, so it's entirely a geological phenomenon?
Entirely geological. The river was the sculptor, not early hominids.
So if we have to throw out the river-shaped rocks, where does the actual proven story of the Khmer people begin in the dirt?
The securely documented human occupation takes us to a limestone cave called Long Spian.
Okay.
It's located in modern-day Battambang province. Excavations inside this cave reveal a cultural sequence dating back roughly 70,000 years before present. This places the early inhabitants squarely within what we call the Hobinian culture.
When we say Hobinian culture, what does, a standard Tuesday look like for these people? Are they living in large villages or are they purely nomadic?
They were primarily hunting and gathering societies, highly adapted to the tropical forest environment of Southeast Asia. A typical day involved foraging for wild yams, tubers, various forest plants.
Right.
And gathering river snails formed a huge part of their protein intake. They hunted small to medium game using stone tools made from river cobbles. And these were tools they actually shaped themselves this time.
Not the river.
Right, not the river. They were slaking the edges to create cutting and scraping implements. And they used these caves as shelters and base camps rather than permanent year-round settlements.
And as we move forward in time to the Neolithic period, the second and first millennia BCE, we start seeing new groups migrating into the Indo-Chinese peninsula.
Yes.
This is where the genetic data tells a really complex story. The research points to groups coming down from southeastern China, and these populations were Austroasiatic speakers.
That's right. Austroasiatic is a broad language family. It includes modern Khmer, Vietnamese, and various indigenous languages across South and Southeast Asia.
Okay.
When geneticists examine the DNA profile of the modern Khmer people, they find a very high degree of continuity with these ancient migrations. The genetic makeup is roughly 84% Southeast Asian ancestry, which shows strong affinities with groups like the Dai people of southern China.
Now, here is the part of the genetic data that I need you to unpack, because the sources also show about 16% Eurasian ancestry.
Yes, they do.
And if you are listening to this, you might immediately think of French colonialism in the 1800s or some recent European contact. But We are talking about prehistoric DNA here, right?
Yeah. We are talking about something much deeper than recent colonial history. This Eurasian genetic component represents prehistoric population movements.
Yeah.
It points to a deep ancestral population, sometimes referred to by geneticists as basal Eurasian, that is related to the ancestors of both modern Europeans and certain Asian populations. This ancient lineage integrated into the demographic landscape of Southeast Asia many thousands of years ago.
And there is also a significant South Asian component, right, ranging from 12 to 15% in present-day Khmer populations.
Exactly. And that South Asian admixture aligns perfectly with historical periods of intense maritime contact and cultural exchange with the Indian subcontinent.
Which naturally bridges us into how the culture explains its own origins.
Right.
We have the hard genetic data, but cultures don't define themselves by DNA haplogroups. They define themselves by stories. And the foundational myth of the Khmer people is the legend of Kandinya and Princess Soma.
It is a profound narrative that is still reenacted in traditional Khmer wedding ceremonies today. Yes, the legend tells of an Indian Brahmin, a scholar and priest, named Kandinya. Prompted by a divine dream, he sails a merchant ship to the coast of Southeast Asia. There, he encounters Princess Soma. She is a Naga, a serpent princess, and she represents the indigenous local inhabitants of the land.
He ends up conquering her army by shooting a magic arrow into her royal boat, but then they fall in love and decide to marry.
Right.
And the detail of this myth from the sources that really sticks with me is the dowry. The princess's father, the Naga king of the sea, literally drinks the floodwaters that cover the entire region. By swallowing the ocean, he reveals the fertile land of Cambodia hidden beneath and presents that dry land as a dowry for the couple to rule.
The myth serves as an elegant historical metaphor. You have the indigenous water-adapted populations, represented by the Naga, blending with the external, highly structured cultural and administrative influences arriving from India.
Represented by the Brahmin Kandinya. I want to look at the physical reality of that myth, though. Because the act of drinking the waters to reveal the land isn't just poetry. It is practically a job description for the early Khmer.
How so?
Well, to survive in the lower Mekong Basin, they had to act like that serpent king. They had to perform intense physical engineering to reclaim the land.
That is a very precise way to look at it.
Sure.
The environment of the lower Mekong is defined by extremes. You have dry, parched periods followed by intense, violent monsoon flooding that inundates vast stretches of the landscape.
Right.
The water levels of the rivers and lakes rise dramatically. They sometimes reverse the flow of tributary rivers entirely.
So to live there, they couldn't just build a standard house on the ground. They built their homes on tall wooden stilts. They elevated their entire domestic life above the floodlines.
Yes.
They learned to capture and manipulate the retreating floodwaters to cultivate rice in the wetlands. They literally had to raise their civilization out of the floodplains.
Their entire survival depended on the mastery of water. And that early adaptation, that engineering mindset, laid the essential groundwork for the very first large-scale organized societies in the region.
Yeah.
Because once a society learns how to manage seasonal floods and build watercraft to navigate inundated forests, they possess the foundational technology to navigate larger bodies of water.
Which triggers the rise of the maritime confederation known as Funan.
Oh.
We're looking at the 1st to the 7th century. This polity was centered right on the lower Mekong Delta, spanning modern-day southern Cambodia and southern Vietnam.
Right.
And our understanding of Funan comes largely from Chinese diplomatic accounts and modern excavations at ancient port cities like Okarpio.
Hunan was an incredibly complex, outward-looking seafaring civilization. They capitalized on their geographic position to become the primary transit hub linking the maritime trade routes of India, China, and the broader Mediterranean world.
Let's talk about the ships, because the Chinese records describe something that defies our usual assumptions about early century engineering. The records detail 200-foot vessels capable of carrying up to 700 men.
It's hard to conceptualize.
It is. How on earth were they building wooden ships of that size in the 2nd and 3rd centuries without modern tools or iron nails?
The naval engineering of the era relied on sophisticated techniques, particularly the lashed lug construction method. Rather than using iron nails, which would quickly rust in salt water, shipwrights used wooden dowels to peg enormous timber planks together.
Okay.
They then carved raised lugs into the interior of the planks and lashed them tightly with braided fiber ropes made from sugar palm or coconut husks. As the wood swelled in the water, the joints became watertight.
Wait, so they are essentially sewing these gigantic ships together.
In a sense, yes, it's a remarkably sturdy method, but building a ship that size requires more than just knowing how to bind wood. It requires a highly organized state apparatus.
Because of the logistics.
Precisely. You need specialized labor to fell the timber in the deep forests. You need elephants to transport the logs to the coast, weavers to produce vast quantities of sailcloth, and you need a huge agricultural surplus to feed a crew of 700 men on a voyage that could last months.
And those voyages were entirely dictated by the weather. Right. They were riding the monsoon winds.
Correct. Maritime trade in this era was governed by the seasonal monsoons. Merchants sailing from India or the Middle East would ride the southwest monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean to reach the ports of Funan.
Right.
But then they had to wait. They had to stay in Funan for several months until the winds shifted to the northeast, allowing them to sail onward to China or back home.
So Funan wasn't just a pit stop. It was this huge cosmopolitan waiting room for the ancient world's merchants.
Exactly.
The sources mention archaeologists unearthing Roman gold coins, Persian glass, and Sanskrit-inscribed seals in these muddy delta ports. But despite all this wealth, all this maritime dominance, the culture eventually shifts its center of gravity.
It does.
As we move from the 6th to the 9th century, Funan fragments, and we see the rise of an inland power called Chenla.
Internal dynastic strife and civil wars in the 6th century severely weakened Funan's centralized authority. This power vacuum allowed a northern vassal state, Chenla, to assert its independence. Under leaders like King Havraman, Chenla began expanding its territory southward, eventually absorbing the remnants of Funan.
Here's what I'm trying to figure out. If Funan was so wildly successful, if they controlled the trade winds and had access to global wealth, why would the Khmer culture pivot inward to become the agrarian-focused Chenla?
Well, it comes down to risk management and state stability. Maritime trade generated enormous wealth, but it was fundamentally volatile.
Because you're relying on other people.
Yes, it depended on the whims of distant markets, the cooperation of foreign merchants, and it left the coastal ports highly vulnerable to piracy and naval raids. By shifting their focus inland to the middle Mekong Valley, the rulers of Chenla invested in something much more reliable, which was intensive wet rice agriculture.
Let's unpack wet rice agriculture, because it's not just throwing seeds in the dirt and hoping for rain. It is a highly engineered environment.
It requires meticulous terracing, the construction of earthen dikes, and precise control over water depth at different stages of the plant's growth. When executed correctly, a flooded rice paddy creates its own microecosystem.
Right.
The water suppresses weeds, and certain types of algae fix nitrogen in the soil, allowing the same plot of land to be farmed continuously year after year without exhausting the soil.
And the caloric output is huge compared to foraging or dry farming. So by moving inland, they traded the unpredictable wealth of the ocean for the predictable, vast caloric surplus of the earth.
Precisely, and with that surplus, they could support larger, permanent populations and a more complex bureaucracy.
During this Chenla period, we see a really distinct linguistic fusion happening. The inscriptions from this era show them adopting Sanskrit for their religious and courtly texts, but keeping a fully developed Old Khmer script for everyday use.
This linguistic dualism is a critical marker of how the Khmer operated. They had a remarkable capacity to selectively adopt foreign concepts while staunchly retaining their core indigenous identity. Sanskrit was utilized to elevate the discourse of the royal court, to write poetry praising the gods, and to legitimize the king's divine right. But Old Khmer remained the language of practical administration, taxation, land disputes, and the daily lives of the people.
It feels very similar to medieval Europe, where the church and the royal decrees operated entirely in Latin, but the farmers and local merchants were speaking vernacular French or English.
That is an apt comparison. And along with the Sanskrit language, the rulers of Chenla adopted the Indian political concept of the Chakravartin.
The universal world ruler.
Yes. A Chakravartin is essentially an ideal, universal king who rules ethically and benevolently over the entire world. The Khmer kings adopted this ideological framework to centralize power and legitimize their expansion.
They were presenting themselves not just as local chieftains, but as universal monarchs ordained by the cosmos. But declaring yourself a universal ruler doesn't prevent local politics from getting messy. By the 8th century, factional disputes caused Chinla to fracture. Historical records from the era refer to this split as land Chinla and water Chinla.
Yes. Land Chenla represented the inland agrarian territories in the north, while Water Chenla encompassed the coastal maritime regions in the south. This division severely weakened their collective defense.
I can imagine.
Water Chenla, with its wealth concentrated along the coast, became highly susceptible to maritime raids from powerful Javanese fleets.
If your coastal half is constantly getting raided and your inland half is disconnected, the whole system is in jeopardy. This geographical and political fragmentation created a crisis that eventually necessitated a unified, heavily fortified inland stronghold.
Exactly. The vulnerability of the divided Chenla states set the stage for a period of intense consolidation. The Khmer needed a capital that was far enough inland to be safe from naval raids, but still connected to the vital water networks required for immense agricultural production.
Which leads directly to the year 802 and the establishment of the empire under Jayavarman II. This kicks off the classical era most people think of.
Right, the peak power under Jayavarman VII, the construction of the sprawling stone cities.
But we promised we wouldn't just look at the stone. We want to know what happens to the people when the stone empire faces a crisis. And the reality of this golden age is that it eventually slammed into a severe, prolonged environmental catastrophe.
The slow decline of the Central Empire, which became highly pronounced in the 14th and 15th centuries, was deeply tied to profound climate fluctuations. We know this primarily from modern dendrochronology,
Which is the study of ancient tree rings in the region. What exactly do the tree rings tell us about the weather 600 years ago?
Tree rings provide a highly accurate year-by-year climate record. Wide rings indicate years of plentiful rainfall, while narrow rings indicate drought. The data reveals that during the mid to late 1300s, the region experienced severe climate whiplash.
Climate whiplash.
They endured decades of prolonged, punishing megadroughts, immediately followed by years of intense, overwhelmingly heavy monsoons.
If you build your entire civilization around an enormous water management system, that kind of volatility is a death sentence. The Khmer engineered these vast, above-ground reservoirs called barays.
Yes, the Bure system was an engineering marvel. Unlike a modern reservoir created by damming a river in a valley, the Khmer built enormous earthen dikes on flat ground to capture rainwater and river runoff.
Right.
The largest of these, the West Bure, is 8 kilometers long. This water was then distributed through a complex network of gravity-fed canals to irrigate the rice paddies during the dry season.
But when you have a decade of drought, the barays run dry, the crops fail, and the population starves. And then when the extreme monsoon suddenly hit, the parched earth can't absorb the water.
The rapid, violent influx of water caused severe flooding. The sheer volume and velocity of the water eroded the earthen dikes and destroyed the spillways. Furthermore, the floodwaters carried enormous amounts of silt from the deforested hillsides.
Which would just clog everything up.
Exactly. This silt choked the canals, ruining the precise gradients required for gravity-fed irrigation.
The infrastructure literally suffocated on mud. And when infrastructure fails on that scale, public health collapses. The records point to outbreaks of waterborne diseases like cholera steadily degrading the population.
Yes.
But what I find truly revealing is how the society reacted to this collapse, specifically in their spiritual and architectural choices. We see a distinct shift away from the Hindu god-king cult, the Devaraja, first toward Mahayana Buddhism, and ultimately settling firmly into Theravada Buddhism.
This religious transition is not just a change in theology. It is clearly visible in the archaeological footprint of Angkor Thom, the walled citadel of the capital.
How so?
During this prolonged period of decline, the state completely stopped constructing monumental stone temples. They no longer had the resources, the later force, or perhaps the ideological justification to build mountains of rock dedicated to kings whose water systems were failing.
So what did they build instead?
Archaeologists excavating the later layers of the city have identified the post holes and foundations of over 70 wooden prayer halls, known locally as Pravihar.
This is a profound shift in the psychological landscape of the people. They move away from these state-mandated, intimidating stone temples dedicated to a distant divine monarch and pivot toward localized, wooden Theravada prayer halls.
It represents a democratization of religious space. Theravada Buddhism emphasizes individual merit, simplicity, and the monastic community over rigid divine hierarchy.
Right.
The construction of the pravihar indicates that the spiritual focus shifted toward the immediate communal needs of the village. Wood is quicker to source, easier to work with, and requires a community effort to build rather than an enslaved labor force. The religion became localized.
And this shift in architecture helps dispel one of the most persistent and romanticized myths about this era, which is the lost jungle city narrative.
Oh, yes.
The idea that the empire fell, everyone vanished overnight, and the jungle swallowed the ruins until French explorers stumbled upon them.
The scientific data soundly rejects the idea of a sudden abandonment. Researchers have conducted extensive sediment analysis from the deep moat surrounding Angkor. They look at the layers of mud accumulating over centuries.
And what did they find?
The evidence of burning for agriculture, forest disturbance, and soil erosion gradually decreases throughout the 1300s.
It's not a cliff edge, it's a slow ramp down.
Precisely. It indicates a slow, phased departure of the administrative elites. The ruling class, the bureaucrats, the engineers who manage the large-scale infrastructure slowly relocated. They likely moved southward to establish new centers of power closer to the coastal trade routes, as the inland agrarian engine had failed them.
So wait, it's almost like a modern corporate headquarters relocating.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
The executives pack up, the IT department unplugs the servers, the building managers leave. The overarching system collapses because the management structure is removed. But the barista across the street, the local residents in the surrounding neighborhoods, they don't vanish. They just stay behind and adapt the empty office spaces for something else.
The ordinary farmers and villagers remained in the shadow of the great temples. They continued to live there. They repurposed the spaces. They venerated local deities among the stone ruins and utilized the courtyards according to their new Theravada Buddhist practices.
Wow.
The empire's administrative apparatus dissolved, but the Khmer people endured.
And their endurance was deeply rooted in a worldview that is much more complex than just switching from Hinduism to Buddhism. The Khmer people developed a highly syncretic spirit world to explain and manage their daily lives.
It is a vibrant, deeply integrated blend of Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, indigenous animism, and ancestor worship. For the Khmer, the supernatural ecosystem is not abstract. It is immediate, tangible, and intimately connected to every physical action they take.
Let's dive into the specifics of this supernatural ecosystem in the sources, because it is fascinating. You have spirits governing almost every aspect of the physical world. There are the Kamaush, which are ghosts, particularly the restless spirits of those who suffered violent or unnatural deaths.
Then you have the Nigta. These are the tutelary nature spirits. They are territorial entities that reside in specific prominent features of the landscape.
Like a particularly ancient tree.
Right. An ancient tree, a distinct rock formation, or a vital bend in the river. They are the guardians of the local soil.
And you appease them by building small shrines, right? You see these little spirit houses mounted on posts near large trees where people leave offerings of incense, fruit, or sometimes meat.
Yes. Acknowledging the Nikta is essential for agricultural success. And moving closer to domestic life, you have the Chongyang Pia, the guardian spirits of the house itself. Every home has its spiritual protectors. And we must also mention the Meren Kongvil.
I love these ones. The Meren Kongvil are described as mischievous little spirit guardians, often depicted as small entities dressed in red. They watch over wild animals and sometimes children. In this worldview, all of these spirits demand proper respect.
They do.
If you ignore them or disrespect their territory, the consequences aren't just bad luck. It manifests as physical illness.
This is a crucial point regarding their practical application of spirituality. When a person in a traditional village falls ill, it is rarely viewed merely as a biological failure. It is frequently diagnosed as a spiritual offense.
So perhaps they cut down a branch from a tree inhabited by a Nikta without asking permission.
Exactly. Or they failed to offer food to their ancestors.
So when the spiritual balance is broken and sickness strikes, who do you call? You don't go to the Buddhist monk for a fever. You go to the Khmer.
The Khmer is the traditional shaman or healer. They operate outside the formal monastic structure of Buddhism. The Khmer possesses extensive botanical knowledge, utilizing specific forest herbs, barks, and roots to prepare medicinal potions.
But their healing is as much magical as it is pharmacological.
They are also the masters of yantra tattoos.
These aren't just decorative ink.
No, yantra tattoos, known locally as a sakyant, are sacred geometric designs, infused with ancient Pali script and animistic symbols. The Khmer applies the tattoo using a long metal spike or bamboo rod, constantly chanting specific incantations during the process.
And what's the purpose of the tattoo?
The belief is that the tattoo endows the bearer with physical prowess, wards off specific illnesses, and provides active magical protection against malicious spirits.
They also rely on the Haura, the local astrologer. You wouldn't dream of building a house, embarking on a long journey, or arranging a marriage without the Haura calculating the exact auspicious day and hour to proceed.
Yes, based on lunar cycles and spiritual alignments. It is a comprehensive system of managing uncertainty.
But I want to pause and ask how this all functions together in the mind of the practitioner. You have a Buddhist temple in the center of the village and an animist spirit house at the edge of the forest. Do the people view these as conflicting religions?
Not at all. They are entirely complementary systems operating on different scales. Theravada Buddhism provides the overarching moral framework. It deals with the cosmic timeline.
Like karma, rebirth, acquiring merit.
Right, and the ultimate pursuit of spiritual liberation. But Buddhism, strictly speaking, does not offer a quick fix for a failed rice crop or a sudden, terrifying fever.
So Buddhism handles the fate of your soul in the next life, but the animistic spirits and the Krukmai handle Tuesday's stomachache.
Precisely. And this resilient, highly localized spiritual framework provided the Khmer people with a profound sense of continuity. Think back to the collapse of the Central Empire.
Okay.
When the capital relocated, when the king's grand stone temples were no longer maintained by a state bureaucracy, the local spiritual infrastructure remained entirely intact. The Nikta in the village tree and the Chamnyingtia in the home did not require a king's permission to exist. This provided immense psychological resilience during times of severe political chaos.
And they were going to need every ounce of that resilience. Because as we move into the post-Angkor period, what historians often call the Middle Period, stretching roughly from the 15th to the 19th centuries, the Khmer people find themselves geographically and politically trapped.
The capital had shifted southward to river ports like Longvek and later Udong. This transformed Cambodia back into an outward-looking maritime trading state, exchanging forest products, resins, and ivory for international goods.
Right.
However, this geographical repositioning placed the weakened kingdom directly in the crosshairs of two powerful, rapidly expansionist neighbors, Siam to the west and Vietnam to the east.
They are caught in a terrifying geopolitical vice. But the pressures exerted by Siam and Vietnam were fundamentally different in nature, based entirely on their underlying cultural philosophies.
Yeah.
Now, the sources detail the policies of both sides, and it's important we simply look at what the historical texts tell us about these conflicts without taking any sides.
Absolutely. The historical texts outline a very distinct contrast. Siam, modern-day Thailand, shared a significant amount of cultural DNA with the Khmer. They both practiced Theravada Buddhism. They both operated under the familiar Chakravartin system of kingship.
So when Siam invaded, what were they looking for?
Siam's incursions were undeniably destructive and violent, but their primary goals were geopolitical dominance and wealth extraction. They sought to force the Khmer king to pay tribute, acknowledging Siam as the superior regional power.
And they engaged in population transfers, right?
Yes, they captured tens of thousands of skilled Khmer artisans, dancers, and scholars, and relocated them to the Siamese capital to enrich their own court.
So they were basically trapped in a real estate nightmare. Siam is the aggressive neighbor who wants to remodel your house, put their name on your deed, and borrow all your best furniture. They recognize your house is basically the same architecture as theirs. They just want to own it.
That's one way to frame it.
And Vietnam, on the other hand, wants to bulldoze the house to the foundation and build something completely alien on the land.
The Vietnamese state was guided by a profound Confucian civilizing mission. Unlike the shared Theravada culture of Siam, the Vietnamese administration viewed traditional Khmer culture, with its decentralized monastic system and animist practices, as fundamentally alien and chaotic.
From a historical perspective, we can look specifically at the policies of Emperor Minh Mang in 1834. Vietnam had established direct administrative control over Cambodia, and they didn't just want tribute, they wanted total assimilation.
Emperor Minh Mang's administration initiated sweeping mandates designed to erase Khmer identity. They forced Cambodians to adopt Vietnamese styles of dress, discarding traditional garments. They mandated Vietnamese hairstyles. They required the use of the Vietnamese language in administrative settings.
And they took direct aim at the religion. trying to replace the Theravada Buddhist structure with state-sponsored Confucian bureaucracy. You can't just tell a culture that believes deeply in karma and local nature spirits to suddenly start practicing rigid, secular, imperial bureaucracy.
The cultural friction was immense. The imposition of Minmang's assimilation policies sparked widespread, violent rebellions across Cambodia. The Khmer people fiercely resisted the eradication of their cultural and religious identity, often fighting brutal guerrilla campaigns in the forests and swamps to push back against the Vietnamese administrators.
To escape this relentless territorial squeeze, to stop being torn apart by Siam and Vietnam, the Khmer monarchy calculated that they needed a substantial counterweight. King Angduam, and eventually his successor King Norodom, sought a distant protector, which inadvertently opened the door to a completely different kind of colonial control.
In 1863, King Norodom signed a treaty establishing the French protectorate over Cambodia. Initially, this treaty served its immediate purpose. It guaranteed Cambodia's borders against Siamese and Vietnamese annexation.
But the French didn't sail halfway across the world just to be friendly bodyguards. They progressively tightened their grip on the internal mechanic of the country. By 1884, the French forced King Norodom to sign a new treaty that stripped the monarchy of its internal administrative autonomy. The French took control of taxation, customs, and public works.
Cambodia was fully integrated into the Union of French Indochina. The colonial focus was heavily driven by economic extraction. They established vast, grueling rubber plantations. Tapping rubber trees requires intense, continuous manual labor in incredibly difficult tropical conditions. They also focused on harvesting valuable timber from the deep forests.
And to manage this extraction, they introduced Western-style administrative courts, which created a bizarre legal dualism. You had deeply entrenched traditional Khmer hierarchies operating right alongside rigid European bureaucratic structures.
The friction between these two legal realities is perfectly illustrated by the 1925 assassination of a French resident named Félix Bardez.
What happened there?
Bardez was traveling through a rural village, aggressively demanding tax payments following a particularly devastating harvest. The desperate villagers, pushed to their limit, attacked and killed him.
When French authorities inevitably arrested the suspects, they put them on trial in their newly established codified European courts.
Yes, the French judiciary prosecuted the villagers according to French colonial law. However, because of the complex treaties governing the protectorate, the final verdict and the execution of the sentences still legally required the royal seal of approval from the Cambodian king.
Because the king possessed the traditional power of pardon.
Correct. It created a tense standoff between the colonial demand for swift justice and the traditional authority of the monarch.
But the most vivid illustration of this tension, the moment where the core of Khmer identity truly asserts itself against colonial rule, happens on July 20, 1942. This is known as the Umbrella Protest.
The Umbrella Protest was a watershed moment in the development of modern Khmer nationalism. The catalyst for the event centered around a man named Hem Chu. He was a highly respected monk and a professor at the Advanced Buddhist Institute at Wat Unalam in the capital, Phnom Penh.
Okay.
French authorities suspected him of preaching anti-French sentiment and plotting a rebellion.
The French decide they need to arrest him. But how they handle that arrest is what ignites the entire country.
To arrest him, the French authorities completely bypassed all traditional Buddhist protocols. In Khmer culture, the monastic community, the Sangha, holds supreme moral authority. A monk is considered sacred. To arrest Hem Chu, the French police forcibly removed his saffron robes, physically disrobing him before taking him into custody.
To understand this, you have to realize that disrobing a monk isn't just an administrative procedure. In the Khmer worldview, it is a cosmic violation. The robes are sacred. The chanting of Pali texts is sacred. Stripping a revered teacher of his robes is an assault on the entire spiritual framework we've been discussing.
The reaction was immediate and unprecedented. Over 1,000 demonstrators marched peacefully through the sweltering heat of Phnom Penh, directly toward the office of the French superior resident, demanding Hem Chu's release.
And the defining visual of this march, the reason it holds its name, is that the crowd included hundreds of monks marching in their bright saffron robes, carrying black umbrellas to shield themselves from the July sun.
The significance of the umbrella protest goes far beyond a single arrest. It vividly demonstrated the limits of colonial power.
Right.
The French controlled the legal courts, they controlled the rubber exports, and they collected the taxes. But they did not control the model center of gravity of the Khmer people. The protests proved that the Buddhist Sangha remained the true heart of Khmer identity, possessing the unique power to mobilize the population in a way the French bureaucracy simply could not understand or anticipate.
The historical record shows that this political awakening laid the groundwork for the nationalist movements that eventually secured full independence in 1953. But as we know, the following decades brought profound, extreme tragedy to the region.
The late 20th century was defined by the devastation of the Cambodian Civil War and the horrific brutality of the Khmer Rouge regime. For our purposes today, we acknowledge these events strictly as the historical catalyst for a massive demographic shift.
The violence and the subsequent refugee crisis caused an unprecedented dispersal of the Khmer population, creating the modern global diaspora.
Exactly.
The map of where the Khmer people live today is vastly different than it was a century ago. And when we look at that map, we also have to recognize that the modern borders of the nation-state don't neatly contain the ethnic population. There are deep-rooted communities that have existed outside modern Cambodia for centuries.
Indeed. In the modern Thai provinces of Surin, Sisaket, and Buriram, there are over 1 million Northern Khmer. These populations have resided there since the era of the ancient empire. Similarly, the Khmer Krom are an indigenous population native to the lower Mekong Delta region, which is now part of modern-day Vietnam.
And they've held on to their identity.
Despite centuries of shifting borders and assimilation pressures, these groups have staunchly maintained their dialect, their Theravada practices, and their distinct cultural identity.
And then you have the communities forged by the refugee crisis, the populations that formed far from the muddy banks of the Mekong Basin. You have huge concentrations in places like Long Beach, California, in Lowell, Massachusetts, in suburbs across France, and in Australia. Which leads me to a question about how culture functions as a survival tool.
How do you mean?
Well, if you completely remove a culture from its geographic homeland, you take them away from the monsoon cycles, the stilt houses, the physical landscape of the Nikta spirits. Does that environment strip away the nature of their traditions? Or does the diaspora act as a time capsule, fiercely protecting those traditions precisely because they lost the land?
The evidence strongly points to the diaspora acting as a fierce protector of intangible heritage. In the face of violent displacement, cultural preservation stops being merely a matter of tradition. It becomes a vital mechanism for psychological survival. It is a way to anchor an identity when the physical geography has been forcibly stripped away.
We see this beautifully illustrated in the efforts of diaspora organizations working to preserve the classical arts, particularly the Royal Ballet and the Apsara dance.
The Apsara dance is a profound example. This is an artistic tradition with roots stretching back to the 7th century. The dancers were historically depicted on the stone walls of the ancient temples, serving as divine messengers between the king and the gods.
It's incredibly intricate.
The choreography is incredibly complex, requiring years of rigorous physical training, starting from childhood, to achieve the hyperflexibility of the hands and fingers. Every single gesture, every bend of the wrist, communicates a specific narrative syllable.
During the tragedies of the 1970s, this art form was nearly eradicated. But today, if you go to a community center in Long Beach or a cultural hall in Paris, you will find masters teaching a new generation the exact, precise movements of the Apsara dance. They are meticulously recreating the silk costumes and the golden headdresses. Teaching an American-born teenager the ancient hand gestures of a water spirit is an act of profound, defiant cultural resilience.
They are actively preserving the physical memory of their ancestors. They are ensuring that the cultural continuity remains unbroken, regardless of the geographic coordinates of the dancers.
So let's step back and look at the immense journey we have mapped out today. We started 70,000 years ago in the caves of Lying, Spain. We watched Neolithic inhabitants learn to build houses on stilts to survive the floods, giving rise to the Naga myths of kings drinking the ocean. We saw the syncretic genius of Chenla, adopting the Indian concept of the Chakravartin while conducting their daily business in Old Khmer.
We observed their critical transition away from monumental stone Hindu temples dedicated to god kings, moving toward localized, community-built wooden Theravada prayer halls in direct response to severe climate stress and infrastructure failure. We examined a highly complex, resilient spiritual worldview that wove Orthodox Buddhism together with animism and magical tattoos, providing daily stability during centuries of political collapse.
We tracked how they navigated the terrifying geopolitical squeeze between the assimilation policies of Vietnam and the tributary demands of Siam. We saw monks wielding umbrellas to protest French colonial disrespect, And finally, we followed the dispersal of the population across the globe, where they continue to meticulously guard their ancient heritage in community halls far from the Mekong.
It is a continuous history characterized by an extraordinary pragmatic capacity for adaptation in the face of overwhelming environmental and political pressure.
Which leaves me with a final thought for you to ponder. We began this exploration by talking about the tension between water and stone. The ancient Khmer built an entire sprawling civilization on the mastery of extreme seasonal water fluctuations. They engineered a brilliant, vast system of reservoirs and canals that eventually collapsed under the crushing weight of prolonged climate stress and unpredictable monsoons.
They did.
But when that immense centralized infrastructure broke, the people didn't simply vanish into the jungle. They adapted. They shifted away from the stone monuments and pivoted toward localized, decentralized community living built on wood and local spiritual resilience. Given the severe climate challenges and unpredictable weather patterns facing our modern coastal and riverine cities today, what vital lessons might we learn from the Khmer people's ancient adaptation, their survival through environmental collapse, and their ultimate pivot toward local, community-driven resilience?
It is a question that deeply connects ancient survival strategies with our immediate global future.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.